So I'm going to get on with this first session, which is a sort of looking at the reality that's facing us in terms of climate change. So our first speaker is Brian Heatley. He's a founder member of Greenhouse and is a former civil servant. And yeah, do you want to say anything else? Who's been? So he's good with figures. That's a key thing. But he's also done some study of history, so he's going to talk a little bit about that as well. Get that in, as long as his fantastic numerical analysis.
Okay, good morning. First, a disclaimer. Anne said I'm a former civil servant. That means I'm not an expert in anything. I like putting the big picture together. So this introductory section is very, by and large, very general. But what is the right big picture is what I want us to address. Facing Up to Climate Reality, our current project, started in the summer of 2015 when we were having our usual annual meeting, and one of us, Ray Cunningham, introduced a session where he said, is it too late? Are we in fact wasting our time with all the effort we're putting into, thank you Rupert, all the effort we are putting into climate mitigation and so on and so forth? Perhaps we are now on an inevitable path of climate chaos and catastrophe. We had what was a very emotional discussion, because I think a lot of us were feeling this, but we're not feeling we could say it. We also noticed that people tend to come into two quite firm camps. They're either extremely optimistic, they think all our efforts, all our campaigning to prevent climate change will in the end work, that okay, there may be some, it won't be too bad, we'll solve the problem. Or, and they put their energy into preventing climate change massively. I think there's a little bit in that reaction which is unwilling to accept a defeat. Or they tend to take a very dark view and talk about things like collapse, end of civilization, even human extinction. What I'm going to try and convince you today is that the reality we face is a shade of grey somewhere in the middle, and it's a rather mottled shade of grey. It's not the same everywhere. And that's what we mean by trying to face up to it, to try and think what it's really like. I'm going to do this in three parts. First, a simple piece about how we're actually getting on in getting down greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, and that first bit will conclude that I think we've got to assume at least 3 to 4 degrees of warming. A second bit, which will talk about what I call the human geography of that 3 to 4 degrees. What does it mean for different parts of the world? And then a third bit, which I won't say much about now, but it will actually be a bit of history, but I think helps us think about it. Okay, off we go. First slide shows the world's greenhouse gas emissions since about 1950. So everywhere up to about here is just history. You can't change that. I've stuck onto it one of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I'll keep calling the IPCC from now on, one of their scenarios, and this is their business as usual as scenario. What happens if the world carries on just as it is and keeps on growing, and you have these massive emissions by then, and you're talking about warming of at least 5 degrees, 6 degrees, maybe more. That in a way is the horror. Along came Paris, 2015, the Paris Agreement, and the next thing I'm going to do is put the Paris Agreement onto that graph. This is what Paris does. It says, instead of going up here, we'll go up there. It doesn't do a lot, does it? First of all, it's only 20 years. Okay, there are promises, we'll do better over here, but that's about it. And the actual reduction is tiny. It's still growing. That is all really that Paris amounts to. Paris said this is to prevent anything greater than a 2-degree centigrade rise. And then it made further promises about 1.5 degrees. I won't even talk about 1.5 degrees. I think Asher may have a bit more to say about it. But to prevent 2 degrees, the IPCC told us that we could only produce another 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide up until in whatever we do from now on. That is a total amount we could emit. Now look what's happened since 2010. We've been at around 50 gigatons. 10 years at 50 gigatons, 500 gigatons. So now, from about 2020, we've only got 500 gigatons left. How can you fit 500 gigatons from here on, and that's about 2020? Well, the best you could do probably is something like that. In 2020, we suddenly turn around completely and leap off a cliff and end the use of fossil fuels. I doubt if anyone in this room believes that that is going to happen. It is completely contrary to the way that large systems, things that are integrated into the whole of our lives, work. We have invested in massive amounts of infrastructure, power stations, roads, transport systems, everything else that use lots and lots of energy. The people who have invested in those things will expect to see returns on their money. This is part of the dynamic of capitalism. You don't just throw away investments, you get as much use out of them as you can for as long as possible, and the notion it's just going to turn around like that, I think, is incredible. The UN have begun talking about a path that looks a bit like that. Now that does look a bit more realistic, maybe about 2.7 degrees. I think that is still pretty unlikely. I think we're much more likely to come out around there somewhere. And if you put degrees on my picture, that means somewhere we wind up somewhere in this region, 3 or 4 degrees. Now that's the climate science, absolutely simplified and probably in a sense wrong, but I find keeping this picture in my head is a way of understanding it. How are we getting on? Well, of course, all this assumes that people do Paris. We know that President Trump has withdrawn the United States. We have a government here which is, at best, rather unenthusiastic, let's put it that way, given although formally they're still standing by the targets, they're expanding Heathrow, they've got rid of most of the subsidies. It's hard to believe that their hearts are in it. Elsewhere in Europe, there's been a survey by Climate Action Europe where they ranked all the European countries on a wide range of indicators. I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but roughly speaking, what were they aspiring to? How were they getting on? How were they getting on in particular in getting rid of coal, and so on and so forth? Where are some of the big countries? Well, the UK is sort of in the middle. The good boy is Sweden. They wouldn't say that anyone was perfect. Germany, of the bigger countries, is probably doing best, big on aspiration, but they say it's not meeting its 2020 targets. It has not got a proper plan for coal, which has been partly an effect of their change in nuclear policy. So they're quite a long way from being good. France, equally, France has been very big on aspiration. I mean, we need to remember the part of France in getting the Paris Agreement agreed, but their performance falls quite a long way short, and quite a lot of their performance is due to their nuclear commitment. At the other end, there's a bunch of countries, of Eastern European countries, which are pretty near the bottom, not performing well, and in particular have substantial problems with the use of coal. That it's traditional, their plans for getting out of coal are weak. Okay, that's the first bit. We think we're likely to end up with 3 to 4 degrees. What does it mean? I'm going to forget that one. Here's the world. And this is where we really get into the very general material. The part of the world that will be, the point of this session is that the different parts of the world will be affected very differently. The part of the world that will suffer the most is probably Africa and the Middle East. It's to do with, as it were, the expansion of the Sahara Desert, which covers, the Greater Sahara, as it were, covers the whole of that region. Increased aridity, increased heat will damage food production. Something like 1 billion of the world's poorest people in some of the most fragile states live in that region. There is no way this is going to lead to anything other than famine and massive migration. That is probably the worst part. Europe catches the effects of the south of that. Southern Spain will become a place where it is very difficult to grow food. Equally, southern Italy. We'll get increased flooding, extreme heat. We know in the UK we're talking about warmer, wetter winters, particularly in the north and the west, and hotter, drier summers, particularly in the southeast. As an aside, I always felt we made a dreadful mistake in the days when we used to talk about global warming, because I think a lot of people in the UK thought that would probably be quite a good idea. And in some ways, it may still be the case. I mean, it's part of the reason, I think, why we don't get a lot of engagement with the topic in the UK. Russia is the one potential gainer from all this. Okay, aridity in the Central Asian part will probably be a problem, but the ability of its agriculture to expand northwards will be considerable, although they'll have problems with their infrastructure sinking into the tundra as the permafrost melts. But they may have advantages from it. South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the two big river valleys are the main concern here, the Indus, the Ganges, which will get very hot, considerably drier than they were, mainly because of the heat. The ability to produce rice will be considerably reduced, and we're quite likely to see substantial famine, substantial migration from that area. China, slightly different. Chinese agriculture depends very much at the moment on irrigation rather than on rainwater, and the irrigation comes from the meltwaters in the Himalayas, and that meltwater will decline. But by some freak of the way the system works, it looks likely that there'll be more rainfall in China, and so there'll be some compensation for that. So the basic IPCC prediction is, yes, there will be localised problems with food production, but probably not an overall problem. I think I'd add that if there is a country that knows how to manage water on a colossal scale, it probably is the Chinese. They've been doing it for 1,000 years, and they may well cope with it. I've not talked about the Western Hemisphere. North America, we're talking about increase in wildflowers, increase in heat, increase in aridity in an area where water resources are already a considerable problem. And I think there may well be quite a lot of internal migration within the United States. But the United States is a rich country. They're used to internal migration. They've been doing it for most of their history. And I think they may handle it. The other thing that's Latin America, equally huge problems in the Amazon, which may dry out. Food production will go down. But there is probably a much bigger margin than there is in Africa. Broadly speaking, the whole of the Western Hemisphere is less densely populated with greater natural resources, so it's less likely to have such extreme stress. It's also surrounded by two large oceans, which may well affect the geopolitics of migration. Last couple of things. First of all, don't try and live in the Arctic or on a small island. They're probably doomed already, that way of life. There's not much further that can be done about that. And another thing that people don't often recognise, but is recognised in the IPCC reports of this, is that around 1 billion people live around the coasts all around the world, particularly in the tropical regions, and they depend on the sea for protein, for fish. As the oceans get warm up and get more acid, those people will increasingly find it difficult to feed themselves. So there is a group of people all around the edge who are going to have problems. Now, all that, it's not me, I've stolen most of that from the IPCC 2014 assessment report. It's just it's not very well known. And I think people don't know very well that it varies in different parts of the world, that we face different things in different places. And I think sometimes we need to remember that when we are thinking about the politics of all this. I think a lot of American unwillingness to face these environmental issues is, very crudely, they've got a lot of environment. We have rather less. Okay, I want to wind up by talking about what does all this mean in the wide sense? Are we talking about collapse of civilization? What's it like? Now, you can engage in a kind of futurology at this point and start thinking, well, what's going to happen to the world trade system and what's going to happen to defence and security and all that kind of thing, which is great fun, but it's very arguable, to say the least. I found another way of thinking about it, which is to say, have we ever been here before? Is there anything in our history that is remotely like this? And the thing I've picked on is what is called by the historians the crisis of the late Middle Ages. In about 1300, Europe had, this is mainly Western Europe, Europe had had what we would call these days 300 years of progress. The population had just about doubled by a massive extension of agriculture. The towns were beginning to fill up again. The towns had gone into decline with the decline of the Roman Empire and through the Dark Ages, but they begin to pick up again, about 1,000, and by 1300 towns are becoming important, with all the things that says for civilization. The money economy was beginning to operate rather than simply an economy of service and serfdom and so on and so forth. It was not complete by any means, but it was beginning to happen, and that was beginning to erode the system that we call feudalism. So, there was a kind of progress in social relations, and the church, the Catholic Church, was in its absolute heyday. This is a time when universities were founded, the first universities, when monasticism expanded massively and became more and more important, when the great European cathedrals were first built. So it is a time of expansion, a time of increasing confidence, all in this 300 years, from about 1000 to 1300. What is more, there was an intellectual advance at this point. In a world where in 1000 really all there was faith in the church and religion, they then rediscovered the Greek philosophers and classics and so on. They had a great crisis trying to reconcile Plato and Aristotle with what the faith was telling them, and they produced in St. Thomas Aquinas an intellectual synthesis. And it led to a world where in 1300 an educated person could think, well, the problem of knowledge has been sorted. We know it all. We understand everything, and unlike now, it was kind of possible for one person to know it all. There wasn't so much then as there is now. Now, that account of 300 years looks rather like an account of 300 years we've just had. We've had an industrial revolution, we've had all kinds of political and economic progress. We're inclined to think we know it all. We certainly think that we can solve our problems with technology. There is a way in which it is quite like where we've been. What is more, they then faced an ecological crisis. There's no great technological development in this period apart from a bigger and better plough that enabled people to use up more and more land. They got to the end of the land they could reasonably use up. Population kept growing, and by the time you get to 1300, people are actually getting smaller. I mean, there is beginning to be stress. They had one substantial ecological problem. We've got loads of ecological problems. We've got it globally. This is just Europe in the late Middle Ages. What happened? Well, this is my hook. It's a bit of a cheat, really. But in 1300, there is some climate change. It's only a little bit of climate change. It's the end of what is called the medieval warm period, the beginning of what became the Little Ice Age, which the important bit is kind of in the 18th century, much later. But around 1300, the average temperature in Western Europe drops by about 0.5 degree. There's a lot of argument about exactly how much it is, but roughly. And the weather gets worse. The weather manifestly gets worse from the records. It starts badly in 1315 to 17 when there is a major famine throughout many parts of Western Europe. In many places, about 10% of the population die. It's quite a substantial thing to happen. The real catastrophe, though, is later on, between 1346 and 53, and you'll probably remember what happened then. It was the Black Death. Now, the Black Death had not been seen in Europe. It had been endemic in Asia for all the period. It had not been seen since the time of Justinian in about the 7th century. People had forgotten about it. The population was completely unprepared. It was also a population weakened by the famine, and so on and so forth. So that about 1/3 of people die. It's very patchy, incredibly patchy. Some places whole villages are wiped out, other places escape, and no one seems to really know why. It keeps returning throughout this period. The last major plague in London is in England is the Great Plague of London in 1666. But I want to concentrate on this period. By 1400, the population that had doubled from 1,000 to 1,300 had halved again. Throughout the entire 14th century, the population halves in Western Europe. It's the sort of scale of catastrophe maybe we're talking about. Now, I think the point I want to make out of that is that this does not result in a collapse. It is an incredible catastrophe, but we do not get a social collapse. We don't get the basic politics, the basic social organisation changing. Yes, people died in famines, they died because of disease, they died because of war. There's quite a lot of war in this period. But the basic structures like kingship, like the remnants of feudalism, although it does put pressure on feudalism, survived. What's more, some people had opportunities as a result of this. One thing that had happened was that the land problem is essentially solved for a while. There are much less people about, much fewer people about. And intellectually, it seems that the main thing people did was look back. They forgot all this nonsense about Thomas Aquinas and so on, went back to the fathers of the church, went back to a more primitive understanding of Christianity. The church itself suffers hugely in the period because, of course, in many areas it ceases to exist when the priest dies, and its whole prestige is damaged. Would have helped if they didn't have two popes for a large chunk of the time, but it reduces the strength of the church. So, yes, there are big changes, but it's not a collapse. And I think it's quite important to understand that it was like that. Moreover, life went on. It's hard to tell what people thought and felt in this period. One source we do have is two great authors who are writing in the early 15th century. One is Chaucer, Canterbury Tales. The other is Boccaccio, who writes the Decameron in Italy. Now, the plague gets mentioned in those, the Decameron, it happens because they've gone out to a country house to escape the plague. But the stories that are in those tales are full of life. They're full of ordinary life. They're full of people's loves and lives and how they cheat each other and how one person puts something over on someone else and so on and so forth. Ordinary life carries on. It is not obsessed by these great changes. And I think that's something we can tend to forget when thinking about this kind of thing. Okay, how relevant is all this little tale to what's going to happen to us globally? One thing I've said already, we have a far bigger problem. It's global. It's not just climate change. We have a whole range of ecological problems. We have advantages. We have in particular medical technology, although which makes me think that disease will be perhaps a lesser problem, but it'll still be pretty awful. The ability to contain contagious diseases depends a lot on the existence of stable governments and public health measures and all that sort of thing, which will not be available in lots of parts of the world. But it makes me think that the nature of the catastrophe will not be in the order, and we're talking about the horsemen of the apocalypse here, famine, pestilence and war. It's probably more likely to be in the order famine, war and pestilence. Because although medieval warfare was destructive and horrible, it's nothing like as destructive as modern warfare. And the conflicts that will arise are probably going to be amongst the biggest causes of death in this period. They had a major advantage. I think that populations in medieval Europe were, in a sense, more resilient. Most people lived much closer to the land, understood how to grow their food, understood how to survive a bad harvest and all that kind of thing. Most of us live in cities, disconnected from these absolutely basic biological processes. We haven't got a clue. And so we're going to be in a much worse position because of that kind of thing. And I think another disadvantage we have is rather like there. They thought knowledge was finished. We are complacent about what technology can do for us. Not all of us are, but most people are. So we're in a different place, but I think thinking about that example helps you think about it perhaps rather more than doing sort of strange futurology. I'm coming to the end. I've lost the relevant piece of paper, but never mind. I think what I've tried to show then is that, look, a really serious problem awaits us because of climate change, and 3 to 4 degrees is pretty much certain. That it has patchy effects in different parts of the world in different ways. That it will result in huge numbers of deaths through famine, through disease, through warfare. That we have to face a world like that. But it's not necessarily collapse or the end of civilization. It might be, but it's not necessarily like that. I'm going to end by saying, because if I don't say this, someone will take me to task for it. None of this is to say that we should give up on efforts to prevent climate change or to make it less bad than it's going to be. But I don't think we can kid people anymore that by doing so, they're going to save the world.
Brian, I'd ask you to just hold any questions or comments you have to the end, because I'd quite like to have our second speaker of this session, and then we could have time for questions and discussion. Is that okay? So Asher has very kindly come along, taken time out of his weekend to talk to. Asher is at the Tyndall Centre at the University of East Anglia. And he's an expert in communication and science.
Yeah, 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming out on a sunny Saturday morning and sitting several stories down in a dark basement. I think that's a dedicated audience, that is. Yes, so my name's Asher Minns. I'm the Executive Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, which is based here at the University of East Anglia, so I'm homegrown. And the Tyndall Centre is very much set up to look at what to do about climate change. We know it's happening. We need to research that more, get more specific, and look at how certain we are, and make more finer resolution models. But the Tyndall Centre sort of starts from that point and says, okay, what we're going to do about it. And I'm a communications professional, which is really unusual, isn't it, for a climate change research organisation? You know, I ought to be here wearing a white lab coat and running lots of climate models. And as far as I know, we're the only climate research organisation in the world who has a communications guy as its, or communications person as its executive director. Because usually these things are run by scientists. But of course, in my organisation, there's a recognition that you can do as much science as you like, but if nobody knows about it, then clearly you haven't really done your job. So I'm going to just talk to you really about people. Do we have a clicker? Where's Simon? No? Okay, so that's okay. So I'm really going to talk to you about people, less about the models and the science. I could stand here for a very long time talking to you about the models and the science, but I suggest you wait till Monday when the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change Special Report, comes out on 1.5 degrees on the Paris goal. So I'm sure you'll all be tuning in at 4 o'clock in the morning, like I will be, because the launch is in South Korea. However, the European launch is on the following Monday the 15th, at the Natural History Museum. So I'm hoping that there'll be quite a lot of attention both to the work alongside the IPCC to the launch in South Korea, the big launch on Monday, as well as the European launch on the following Monday. Now, there's a reason to explain that. One is because I guess as an apology that I'm not going to hit you with the science, because you're going to be hit with the science anyway on Monday. We might talk about it a little bit, but also it's embargoed, so I can't talk about the science either or the later science. But I will add that what I think is very exciting. So I've been doing my job for about 20 years. So if you've heard about climate change, I thank you. So I've been banging away at climate change research for quite a long time, or communicating climate change research for quite a long time. Okay, it wasn't all me. Some other people were involved. But on Monday the 15th, the Natural History Museum, what I think is very exciting about this new report, the 1.5 degree report, let's forget about is it achievable, is it not achievable, how are we going to do it? There's a chapter on behaviour in the 1.5 degree report. Behaviour, people, not the models, how do we replicate the world, how many wildfires, all this sort of thing. It's actually people's behaviour. And that's where I come in on the communication side, and I will be one of the people speaking at the Natural History Museum exactly around that. But the first IPCC report was 92 to 95, so it's taken that long for people, behaviour, to come into what the Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel on Climate Change does. So I'm very excited about that, and really looking forward to the gig at the museum to talk about that. So again, a bit of no, actually I won't make that joke again, I already did. European attitudes to climate change. I was at the launch of this, speaking at this last week in Brussels. Tens of thousands of people surveyed for this every 2 years in all sorts of issues, well-being, all sorts of things, not specific to climate change. But my colleagues at the University of Cardiff, which is another of the Tyndall centres, managed to get climate change in as a question. And this means that for every 2 years, for all of time, there will be questions about climate change to the whole of the European community, citizens. Now, the important thing about this is that this isn't just sort of like these Mori or Ipsos polls where you phoned up, cold called and said, are you interested in climate change, blah, blah, blah. These are 1 hour focus groups in people's houses. They have really, really proper conversations. It's cross-checked, cross-verified, all sorts of questions asked to really tease out what people think. Well, I guess I'm going to make the joke again. I thank you that after 20 years, when I first started at the Tyndall Centre, we were going to sort of church halls and anywhere just to talk to people about climate change. It's something we're a bit worried about, and we think that you should be hearing about it. To where we are now. So the UK, 94% of people think the climate change is changing. 91% of people think it's partly caused by human activity. And 66% of people think it's the impacts will be bad. So from a communications perspective, wow, that is world notoriety of climate change. And we could do the whole thing for all the European countries, as well as Israel and Russia, and adding in a few others. And actually, if you repeat these surveys, not in depth like this one so much, but there's been surveys around climate change for forever. And I've done that, you can see across the world people are very interested or worried about climate change, even in relatively newish parts of the world where climate change wouldn't necessarily be a big issue. So even in places like in China and Russia, it's still 40% of people have some sort of concern about climate change. So climate change is the concept of it is worldwide, and people are thinking about it. And I can show that by just teasing out. So now I've just taken out the UK data, so just because I can't talk about everybody everywhere. So you said 95% of people think the climate is changing in the UK. We did that one already. 70% of them are worried about it. If we add up to somewhat worried to extremely worried. UK data. and 70% of people are thinking about climate change. So that's really a bit different than what you generally hear from sort of green groups and activists, and they're like, oh, nobody's taking climate change seriously, nobody's interested in it, nobody's heard of it. Actually, the data shows that really isn't the case. And if you're a comms person, if you're a political party, if you were a Apple wanting to sell your product and you had that sort of market niche, that sort of recognition, you would be so excited. You know, it's absolutely remarkable, so a bit different to the science. And there's also a lot of climate change in the media as well. So I guess if I keep standing here, I'm in the way, not so. There's a lot of climate change in the media. So so this is 2000 to now, last month. Reporting of climate change in the UK newspapers. Again, this is done for world newspapers, but I just picked out UK. And climate change news carries on. There's always some climate change news. There's spikes in climate change news. Anybody know what the spikes are? Yes, exactly, yeah. The UN climate summits. And the black line is all of those added together. So there's a lot of climate change every day in the news, at least every month in the news. And that's probably the place where most people are getting their information about climate change. And this pattern is actually sort of repeated the world over. So I could have given you the world graph here, but it's pretty much repeated the world over. We see this pattern decline and falls, you know, peaks and troughs. Sort of heyday of climate change in the news was here, but it's not far off from here either. This is the Paris Agreement, and like I say, I've worked in climate change communication from here, so I could probably spend the next 3 days telling you what each of those little dips are, but I'll spare you that. So. Awareness is high, yeah? Kind of laboured that point worldwide. If we were, well, not if we were, we would be, based on that data, we should be very excited that consistency of response and consistency of interest. Actually, there's the clicker. Does that not work? Hang on. Bear with me, people. Clearly not. No. Okay. It's worth a test. So here we are. Everybody's heard about climate change, everybody's worried about climate change, lots of people are thinking about climate change. But what exactly are we asking them? So if we're talking about the Paris Agreement and 1.5 and 2 degrees and you know, where do we go next, where are we going to end up? What we're asking them is pretty much this. So imagine you're sitting in a basement in Norwich, and a hurricane is approaching. What do you do? Well, actually, we're going to say here in a basement in Norwich. Where else? You know, we just carry on, go out to the destruction at the end of the day. But we think, okay, well, yeah, we know it's coming. We've got good assessment of the risk. We know it's going to be here in 2 hours because the weather people have told us. Let's make sure we've got enough supplies, some food, what are we going to do when the electricity goes? Are we going to get some candles? You know, just things that we're going to tell everybody else in the forum. You know, we know it's coming. You know, there's a market going up there. We suggest you take everything down because it's going to just take out the church. You know, all this sort of thing. But on the other hand, imagine you're sitting in a basement in Norwich and climate change is happening. What are you going to do about it?
Talk.
Say it's Donald Trump's fault. It's the government, or what is it? Cycle to work, change your light bulbs. And it's an issue of risk. Yeah. So when the risk is clear, we know what to do. We've all been educated in what to do, especially if we're in places where they're in the tornado belts and things. All the kids know what to do. They're taught it at primary school. all the Japanese kids know what to do when there's earthquakes, which aren't necessarily warnings, but they know exactly how to react. And that's the problem. Awareness is high when we're peak awareness. What, do I get extra money in my salary when it gets to 100% of people are worried about climate change? How far up more can we go? But really, we don't know what to do, and those of us working in climate change aren't really telling people what to do or how to respond to this. We're just kind of giving them this information and then saying, sort it out, cycle to work. In communication theory and marketing, there's ADA. So I introduce you to ADA: awareness, interest, desire and action. So awareness, 93% of people. Interest, 70% of people are thinking about it. Yeah, okay. Desire, maybe not. There's not so much going on from a public perspective. Maybe governments are doing things and big businesses are doing things, but in terms of public, and action, well, as Brian showed, kind of the indicators are all rather going the opposite direction. And one of the things we do at the Tyndall Centre is the global carbon budget. Every year for the UN climate summits, we put out the latest point of the graph, which is going on at the moment. Yes, and it's an amazing 24-hour-a-day analysis going on north and south. The data is swapped around the world according to what time zone people are in to get one point on the graph, which is where global emissions are for the year. So we're just doing 2018 now. Ask you what you think the result is, because I can't tell you either. I'm so embargoed at the moment. Well, let's have a think. So, global carbon emissions have been going up, or are going up. They flattened out for a few years. Last year they went up again slightly. This year, for 2018, on the 3rd of December, you'll find out where global carbon emissions have gone for 2018. Put your hand up if you think they've dropped. Nobody thinks they've dropped. Put your hand up if you think they've flat. Okay, a few hands for flat. And put your hand up if you think they've gone up. Put your hand up if you think they've gone up a lot, although I'm not going to say what a lot is. Okay, just, you can decide what a lot is. Okay, right. So most people think they've gone up, not necessarily a lot, even though I'm going to get into trouble if I define what a lot is. So we're at this. We've got the awareness. We're wanting to get to action. If you're going to deliver on something like Paris or any type of climate agreement, it's not just down to Donald Trump, is it? It's down to the people who elected him. It's down to sort of everybody having some sort of role and thinking this is something to go beyond. I'm worried, and one might even say we have a some sort of public or moral obligation. If people are worried about something, what do you do to help them, especially if you're some of the people who've created that worry? So excuse me. So this is the one data graph I think I'm going to show, because this has already been published. So I'm not going to get in trouble when this video goes around the world and trends. So this is the Paris goals, okay? So 1.5 and 2 degrees, that is the goal of the Paris Agreement. And, well, let's just go for 2 degrees because it doesn't really matter too much. Sorry about the shadow. To achieve 2 degrees, so no additional climate policy is not, that's according to something called the Cancun Accord. So that's what countries agreed to do. It's sort of it's the pledges under Paris. So that's where the trajectory of carbon emissions over time. So carbon emissions over time, CO2 emissions over time. That's the trajectory according to sort of the Cancun Accord. Demand reduction. That's people reducing the amount of CO2 that they produce, because they've actually they're demanding less. They're using less transport, less energy, changing their diets or whatever. Then low carbon supply would be swapping out to, so we have energy that isn't fossil fuel energy, forestry, changes in forestry and land use here, it doesn't make too much of a difference. Carbon capture and storage, which is the idea of, okay, you can burn fossil fuels, but you trap the carbon dioxide and hide it away underground until you come up with a better technique. And then biomass energy carbon capture and storage, forgive the acronyms, which is carbon capture and storage. So the same idea, you put the carbon dioxide underground, but you generate the electricity by burning biomass. So it's sort of carbon neutral. But it's not carbon neutral because you bury the carbon, and so you end up carbon capture, so the carbon's not going back into the atmosphere. And this is what you need to get into negative emissions. So negative emissions is what it says. So we're not talking about slowing emissions or reducing emissions, we're talking about zero emissions, so that there's actually no carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. And then beyond zero emissions, negative emissions, is sucking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So this gives you an idea of what is necessary for the Paris goals. And this one I think is most interesting, demand reduction. These other ones are to do with citizens as well, but demand reduction is very much in the hands of citizens. People actually using less energy, changing the ways they think about using energy, changing all their habits and lifestyles. So I'm playing around in here for the next few minutes. So, well, how do we do that then? So awareness is high, trying to get to action. Something called psychological distance, which for the sake of time I won't tell you a story. But psychological distance is really that. It's climate change, as Brian's map of the world show, happening to somebody far away in the future. We're never even going to meet them. And that's a big problem with the psychology of climate change communication. And these just outline that same concept, and also the finite pool of worry. We all have a finite pool of worry. There is only so much stuff that we can be worried about every day, and climate change quite naturally doesn't come to the fore because right now I'm dealing with how to get my kid to school. We're not kind of having some sort of existential thought about what's going to happen by 2080. That just doesn't happen. So overcome psychological distance. As an example, see, I'll do anything for climate change, including being. I'm here. I'm John Tyndall, Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. He's the man that worked out why the sky is blue. So that's and greenhouse gases. So the reason I put this up actually is because this was only done a couple of weeks ago. It was here in Norwich. Started doing a bit more public events. I'm less international than I was, and so I just started asking people what it is at a local level. So I'm trying to overcome psychological distance here. At a local level, what they were interested in. This is a bit of science as well, actually. I fibbed, didn't I? I said I was only going to show you one graph. This is a drawing of Norfolk. You may hopefully recognise where you live. And around 1.5 to, by the end of the century, summer rainfall decreases by 30%. Flooding, winter flooding, some would get increases, but it's a wide range. Decline 3%, minus 3% in wheat, which I think is a major crop in this region. Sea level rise up by about 0.4 centimetres. Just an idea of where we would get to by meeting the Paris Agreement at the end of the century. On the other hand, we see things like all the offshore wind going on, so there'll be, and that target achieved, but will go beyond 10% of electricity is from offshore renewables by 2020. There's about 170,000 electric vehicles on the UK roads, so I do point out this is in Norwich, but massive waiting lists. Solar, of which actually we do see quite a lot around Norfolk, don't we? Has gone from 0 to 27% of electricity in this summer, which was a particularly good summer if you happen to be a solar panel, in 10 years as well. So yeah, these are the impacts, but these are the responses as well. And admittedly, these are the sort of the big government industry responses. Apart from some people obviously have got solar on their roof. So this is just some of the stuff that's going on. I'm not quite sure why Norwich Cathedral looks like a rocket. I think there's some bushes. So I was asking people here in Norfolk, what is it that they are most interested in? What is it that they're most wanting to protect? And how much in time-wise?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, perfect. So they want to protect people and property. This one could be a bit under surprise. What's your priority, your mitigation priority, sort of in reducing carbon dioxide emissions, and apparently complete radical transformation of the economy. Maybe I'd already loaded that by making jokes about cycling to work and things, but it was that one did. This is my bread and butter, understanding what the public thinks and what they do, and looking at all the surveys and the polls. So, maybe now I'm spending more time back in Norwich and in the UK, I'll get to understand this one a little bit better. I'll skip over Ada because we already did Ada. This is complicated, but this is Schwartz. This is Shalom Schwartz. And he did the mother of all assessments of people's values. And nothing to do with climate or environment, just everybody's values. And values are the guiding principles of our lives. Values are everything. They are what we do, why we do, why we do our work, perhaps, why we choose to do particular professionals, why we dress in certain ways to signal to other people this is who we are, this is how we are. Now, the only reason I put this up is environment people, well, they're brilliant at talking among themselves. They sit up here where they all have the same values of universalism, protecting the environment, inner harmony, social justice. Well, that's lovely, but what about everybody else? And everybody else is where I'm at. But the point for everybody else is now, because it's 93% of people, wanting to go that little bit further, start to respond to it. I won't talk too much about this. We use this in our communication campaigns. Pretty much anything you bought from a big international organisation, they did this when they decided whether they were going to advertise in The Guardian or how they were going to get to you and what type of labelling they were going to use. So this whole this values thing is very important, and distances are real in Shalom Schwartz's work. So universalism is a long way from hedonism. But that doesn't mean that people are in this all the time, because maybe these are your overarching values most of the time, but you also go to Glastonbury Festival, so you can move around this all the time, or you can go skiing, so it's not to say that these are mutually exclusive, but it's a very, very useful framework that we should be thinking about and working with if we want to talk to people about climate change who aren't only the people who come to talks about climate change. It's very important, and it works. And just in terms of sort of tone of voice and how we talk to those people, and actually your Middle Ages, you mentioned sort of Aristotle of the people collecting the works of. So Aristotle, allegedly, he was a master of narrative and rhetoric. So you know, in ancient Greece, they had all these dialogues and discourses, and that was part of the state. And he wrote, and it hasn't changed. There are only 7 types of plot in the world. These are them. All of them are hero stories. All stories have heroes. And all stories, or nearly all stories, are triumph over adversity. So all of these are somebody kind of doing better or having a problem and overcoming a problem. And that's important because of hero stories. We can't be saying to people, not a chance, it's not going to happen, because that is a prophecy that fulfills itself. To engage, we use Aristotle's principles of stories, which have been proven over and over and over again. If you went to creative writing in UEA or anywhere else, if you happen to work in Hollywood, these are the foundation principles of stories. Quite fun actually is Christopher Booker, who's quite a climate skeptic, writes quite a lot about climate skepticism, like proper climate skeptic. He actually recently wrote a book on this, and he still found out that there is still only 7 plots in the world. So hero stories, overcoming adversity, absolutely key. Because we don't want to be narrators of doom, be a climate change hero instead. And I'll skip that one actually. But then I was talking about the psychological distance, which is just one of the issues around the cognition of climate change. There are others. Is sometimes, in fact, a lot of the time, we don't even need to talk about climate change. We don't even need to mention climate change. Now we should, because effectively it's a big brand, as we can see. Lots of people are interested in it and aware of it. But, so this is Norwich. So Norwich has successfully reduced its carbon emissions from 2005 to 2016. This is per capita CO2, so basically the lines doing this. So Norwich as a city has successfully reduced its emissions, mostly because of just the change from fossil fuel energy to gas energy. So it's not anything particularly specifically local, but this is, you can see similar patterns across the whole of the country. This could be the UK. But its transport emissions have continued going up, or have dropped and are now going up again. Air pollution in Norwich, this is using other people's data. So this is the target, is 40, and lots of air pollution in Norwich is way above World Health Organisation guidelines. It's a small place, it really shouldn't be the case. And in terms of the local competition, I can only look at this from a regional point of view, but the east of England has got the same emissions as London. And so, it could be doing significantly better than it is already, but we don't even necessarily need to be talking about climate change when we're talking about whether our children can breathe or not. So this just came out of, I popped this into the slide deck this morning. Isn't that quite something? These people are dealing, UNICEF deals with all sorts of kids all over the world in all sorts of problem areas and conflict areas and catastrophe areas. But they're saying basically the kids are choking to death in the UK because your air pollution is so bad, which I think probably is a form of child abuse, isn't it? Because we've known this, and we've known this for a really, really long time. And the co-benefits of not having our kids choking to death when they're at school are the same co-benefits of acting on climate change. So we don't even necessarily have to talk about carbon dioxide a lot of the times. We can just talk about the here and now, deal with psychological distance. All these environmental problems are interlinked. And back to the narrative, hope and ambition requires an uncertain future. So even though we might have a pretty good idea of which way the trajectories are heading, that doesn't mean, exactly as Brian said, we don't do our best to bring those trajectories down or make them less difficult or more impactful, especially if we've got co-benefits like kids not effectively losing a year of education because of air pollution in their schools. It's cognitively, it's thought to be about the same. It's the equivalent of taking kids out of a school 1 year early because of what doesn't happen in their cognitive development. So lots of co-benefits, and hope requires an uncertain future. I could have stood here and showed you lots of graphs of different trajectories, different probabilities. The journey is in one direction, so what we have to do is really understand people and use what I call the science of climate change communication to bring these down. I'll stop there.
Okay, if you just turn it off. Sorry.
No. It's not.
All right, is it
Still on?
Yeah.
Just on that thing about people accepting the reality of climate change, you might like to know that the BBC has recently changed its policy or put out a sort of statement about how climate change should be dealt with, saying that editors don't have to have a climate denier on to give some sort of balance. At least credit is due to Rupert Reed over there, who put out a tweet when he got phoned up by Radio Norfolk?
Cambridge.
Radio Cambridge, that's it. BBC Radio Cambridge. In the middle of the heatwave in July, and asked to go on some discussion programme with a climate denier, and he thought, this is ridiculous, so I'm going to say no, because that got picked up on Guardian. He wrote an article in the Guardian, and then a letter that got signed by lots of people in the environmental movement, saying that they wouldn't share a platform with people that denied climate change. So at least we're sort of getting there, getting the sort of powers that be to recognise that this is now accepted, and we shouldn't be debating the fact that it's happening anymore, but what are we going to do about it? So this is your opportunity now to ask questions, make comments if you like. I'll take about 3 questions for either speakers or comments, and then we'll have a response. I'm hoping if you stand up and speak loudly, perhaps we won't need to pass the microphone around.
Thank you very much, both of you. Fascinating presentations. But I want to respond a little bit to what you said, and also disagree a little bit with Asha, because policies are not integrated. We know that nitrogen dioxide emissions as a proxy can be related to other things. We know that clean air is part of the same thing, in a sense, as climate change. But the policy people and the media don't get that. You showed a graph of NO2 levels in Norwich. Knee-jerk reaction to that from the local authorities, we need to ease traffic flow. We put the NDR around, so, we'll produce more CO2 because people are driving further. And, the main culprits are buses, so we want to get the buses out of the way. Hang on, they're part of the solution. Likewise with the media. Yeah, okay, so they're not now going to, or BBC, not now going to put a climate denier up against scientific evidence of climate change. But they don't link things together. It was either this morning or yesterday morning on the radio, someone from a car company talking about, if there's no deal in Brexit, we might have to close because our just-in-time deliveries won't work. Hang on, that's part of the problem. Didn't have anyone saying, actually, getting rid of just-in-time deliveries would be a benefit. They don't put those things together. So I think we're still a long way short of where we want to be. Thank you.
One more.
Hello, I'm Andrew Rolls. I'm an independent environmental consultant. Some of you'll know I was a county councillor here for 12 years. I'm interested in policy and law, really. My question really is about the how do you convert that communication you're talking about, particularly Asher, but I think this is a question for both panellists. The sorts thing you put up, Asher, that was really interesting, but I think that's really more about individual behavioural change. What about how do you convert that communication about climate change to policy change? Because that is the other part of the question. Behavioural change of individuals is important, but we really need that policy change. It strikes me that probably the politicians are on the left-hand side of that sorts chart, or tend to be. So how do we connect to those politicians to really get engaged the policy action that we need?
Thank you. That woman at the back, sorry, you could ask this.
I guess, sorry, I was up with my notes. So, I guess,
could you stand up and
sorry,
speak up so everybody can hear?
Sorry, everyone.
If people can't hear, just shout out and we'll do something.
So I guess I was really interested in what both of you were saying, but the thing I keep rallying against is the focus on individual responsibility as opposed to corporate or national responsibilities. And so much of what we talk about, like you said, like cycling to work or recycling or reducing your water, is focusing so much on what individual behaviours are. And whilst I do believe in my duty and the ability of people who are able to do that, that really is difficult for me for people who don't have that choice, people from low-income backgrounds, people of colour, disabled people who can't actually necessarily make those changes in their lives or don't have the access to the things that allow them to do that. And I'm finding it really difficult at the moment with lots of climate change activism because it's focusing so much on individuals and it's not necessarily talking about how we as individuals can change the behaviour of the corporations who are doing the large numbers of the polluting.
Okay, I'll leave the first question, I think, to Asher, although the not linking things together on the news drives me mad continually. I keep thinking, why aren't they mentioned X, why aren't they mentioning Y? It's very annoying. How do we convert communication into action and policy change? One of the problems of our politics is that politicians at the moment, in a current phase of our history, are obliged to be universally optimistic. They must always promise that their policy is going to deliver a better tomorrow. This is absolutely built in to the whole way we look at the world, because of course we believe in progress. It's all going to get better all the time. Now, the basic problem with the sort of things I was saying is that I'm also saying that, well, maybe progress has come to an end for a bit. There's going to be a certain amount of regression, and you are going against that very deep and fundamental assumption. So I don't know how you turn being realistic about climate change and what is going to happen into practical politics, to be honest. I would like to see how it can be done, because the focus is always on optimism. We will make it all right, and the better, greener world will be nicer to live in too. Well, what we might promise by what we are saying going to do politically is a world which is less bad. It's very hard to see how you get past that. I think there has to be some kind of crisis, some kind of event that changes the whole feeling of politics. Equally, I'm in politics because I find the focus on individual responsibility irritating. I mean, I think fundamentally, yes, individual responsibility is quite important and we can change things through it, but I almost see it as a political ploy by the world, the corporate world, the government world that doesn't want to change very much, to put the responsibility on us when the basic responsibility on the big decisions that are made about how we do things are made by them, not by individuals.
On politics and policies, yes, you're right. They mostly are driving in the wrong direction. There's some very good policies going on, but those completely rotate with governments. Possibly most people wouldn't like to hear that the best thing for UK carbon emissions was Margaret Thatcher closing down the coal mines. But that's what you get if you only look at one policy at a time. You also devastated entire communities, and people, the children of children are still unemployed in some of those places in the world. That's in the UK, so that's what happened when you just sort of focus on we're going to close down the coal. I agree. I'm not going to disagree. A personal comment, nothing to do with my work, is I just wonder why people vote. Because I think that would actually have more influence than doing the Lemming Act every 4 years, and which nasty tasting lager do you wish to have at the bar? Why would you, or do you leave the pub? I leave the pub, personally. So that's not a direct answer, but I just agree with you. Why on earth is it that we think politicians are going to look after us? I'm not a baby. I don't get it. But on, very interesting question. Sorry, I've lost. There you are. Yes, sorry. About and some of the other people's questions were sort of individual responsibility versus group responsibility. I've got just two quick things to say on that. Please read a book by Edward Bernays, written in the 1930s. It's not a very big book. It's called Crowd Control. And Edward Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew, right? So Sigmund Freud being the psychoanalyst, sort of famous for relationships around sex and family and things like that. So nephew Ed, used Uncle Sigmund's theories to be what is the sort of slightly self-styled father of public affairs. And he probably is more responsible for consumption than anybody else. And so he wrote loads of things in the 1930s and actually lived to be quite old, so you can really trace his books if you want to. But I would recommend that one. And one of my favourite, a bit light anecdotes, but just to describe his approach. He sold all sorts. He sold cigarettes to women because he made them a feminine status symbol. That was Edward Bernays. He later recanted, I should point out, when the evidence came in. Sold all sorts. But my favourite is he sold pianos to the American middle classes. He sold pianos, as in millions and millions and millions of pianos, when Steinway maybe kind of sold one every 5 years or something, by making a music room aspirational. None of those pianos were ever played. And that was pretty much kind of sums up what he did. So similarly, hope, ambition, all these sorts of things. So have a look at that one. But also relate to that and why I said about how to sell pianos to the middle classes, make them aspirational, is about 90% of emissions come from 10% of the population. So we know exactly who we're talking to. Absolutely. We know who these people are, we know where they live, we know where their kids go to school. That 10%. So in a way, it isn't individual responsibility, it's the influencers and, for want of a better expression, the thought leaders who also are the same people who work in corporates. These aren't like different specimens of, you know, these are the same people. They're also the people commanding the markets and the like. So like in all communication, just be targeted. I think, and, you know, just work with those people. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
We've only got a few minutes left, but I'll do 3 more questions. Rupert, that woman over there, and yes, you're in the front. Sorry, everybody else.
So I felt a strange dichotomy between the two talks, to be honest. It seemed to me that Brian tried to present us with a view of what the reality was going to be vis-à-vis climate change. And it seemed to me that Asher's talk was premised on that not being the case. So I want to offer a challenge here to the two speakers to try to reconcile their two talks. So Asher, for example, you talked about the Cancun and Paris policy goals and targets and so on, but Brian's thought, and it seems to me eminently realistic, is there is absolutely no realistic plan to achieve those targets. And there are absolutely realistic plans to build roads and expand air travel and so on, which are bound to rupture those targets. You talked about BECCS. Well, BECCS, there's no reason to believe it will work at scale, and there's every reason to believe that if it's done at scale, it will be an ecological catastrophe, which is why most green groups oppose it. You said that Norwich carbon emissions have been going down, but of course that's not true if one includes outsourced emissions, air travel, etc. So, you know, the reality is they're not going down. And you gave us this happy graph about media coverage, but I couldn't help noticing that on the graph there was less climate change coverage than there was a decade ago now, which is incredible, given that the problem is now much worse. So, just on your list of stories, I'm coming to an end. Your list of stories, you had 7 plots. I noticed one you didn't mention, which I'm sure I wasn't the only person in the room to spot, was tragedy, and that seemed to be the one that Brian was telling us about.
Okay. So, yeah, sorry, go on. Would you like to stand up?
I just think that, I mean, I'm just an ordinary member of the public, you know, who happen to have done an environmental science degree. I just think that councils should be doing a lot more, actually. You know? I mean, you know, and I've got 2 things. The first one is I live in a council flat and it leaks heat because the housing people have no idea how these buildings work. I mean, they should all go on a course. They know all about people and their problems and da-da-da-da-da, but they don't seem to realise that if you leave the top windows in the passage open, you know, in the middle of winter, it sucks everybody's heating. People don't know this. I said, why don't you do a publicity campaign to actually point this out in these very old, very well-built buildings, you know, who are not designed to have their windows and doors open at any, you know, season of the... And people don't realise, until you've got somebody upstairs from you who is constantly opening the bloody doors and windows, you don't realise. And my heating bill has gone up by about 50%. And then on top of all that, if that is not enough, they go and put metal doors in with no insulation, so it was actually warmer before, even with the people opening the doors and windows, than it is now.
Perhaps you need to talk to your local councillor.
You know, cost about £1,000 each. I mean, it is ridiculous. These people need to be educated, you know? And the other thing is...
Just quickly, because we
very short. I think it's about time people are encouraged to switch off their engines at traffic lights. And also, I'm constantly seeing people, the woman goes into the shop, does the shopping, and the man, or, you know, I'm just making, sits there with their engine running. And I'm constantly going up to them, excuse me, would you like to switch your engine off?
Yeah.
When your partner comes up, you can just switch it back on.
Right, thank you.
It's not a problem,
Yeah.
you know?
Are there any councillors present?
Yes.
There you go. Would you like? And you're up next. Would you like to? You had a. Yeah.
I just wanted to talk about the
Very briefly.
situation in Norwich and Norfolk. It's actually not a rosy picture we've seen from the graphs at all. It's going completely in the wrong direction. And one reason is that the county council, signed up to by all the major parties, have made road building in Norfolk the #1 spending priority. What's happened with the Northern Distributor Road around Norwich? It's going to increase transport emissions in Norfolk by 6% by 2032. And on top of that, all the main parties, they want to dual the A47, they want to extend the NDR across the Wensum Valley. So what's happened is we've got Norwich has outsourced its transport emissions, outsourced its emissions. The NDR has created a new development line around the edge of Norwich, out-of-town development. People go to the hospital out of town, employment sites on the edge of town, huge amounts of housing on the edge of town. Greenfield is cheaper to build than brownfield sites in the city centre. So we've got more car and reliant car lorry journeys in Norwich. The Greater Norwich Local Plan is now going to take us even further down the path of climate change. A huge new development proposed for Honningham. Huge new industrial food hub proposed for Easton. And that's because the county council, with the city council, the Labour City Council, want to make the traffic case for the NDR. So there's a huge amount you can do locally. You can object to these roads. You can say we want spending priority to be on sustainable things, not on carbon-intensive things which are going to make our future worse.
Yes, but then you object. And you actually go to a council meeting and you do your question and everything, and you are completely ignored. It is like talking to a brick wall, you know?
Okay,
Yes.
I think we'll have to,
Absolutely
we'll have to continue this discussion later on. But I know that you might want to respond, but could you just talk?
Yeah. Do you want to take another question? Because I think it's much easier to hear from the audience.
Yeah, but we've actually run out of time for this session. See, it says 11:30. Coffee break, coffee, tea. And it's now nearly 2. So I'm going to stop it now, I'm afraid. And please respond to movement.
Yeah. Well, that was what I was going to say. I was going to say that's why I said take another question, because I can talk to Rupert separately anyway.
Talk to Rupert separately.
There's all these people here that we could have conversations with rather than people we know.
Fine. So
I'll come and take your question.
I'll just say one more. Just say again. Please sign up on the registration sheet for those of you who came in late, including the speakers. And so we've now got a quick break until